truth,
love,
and the good.
Here we go.
Here we go. Welcome to the DTPHD Podcast. I'm David Tian, Ph.D. and for the past 10 years, actually 11 years, I've been helping hundreds of thousands of people in over 87 countries attain success, happiness, and fulfillment in life and love. And I'm joined by my good friend, Henry CHONG.
Yes, hello.
Yes, and Henry is currently, you're in Hong Kong.
I'm in Hong Kong, yeah.
Okay, so in case you don't know who Henry is, I'll let Henry introduce himself.
Yeah, I am Henry CHONG. I am the CEO of the Fusang Group, which is a private investment office. But I'm here today to talk with you, David, about life and love and happiness and many other things besides. And always honored to be a guest on this podcast and to talk about, well, many interesting topics. So let's dive in today.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so this is a topic that we've been putting off for a while because it's so big, and it's the topic of masculine and feminine energies. And related topics are like toxic masculinity, the chemistry and how that's related, whether there even is a thing as masculine and feminine, how the masculine and feminine is related to male-female, lots of big topics. So part of our hesitation to tackle it is because we try to keep these under 30 minutes and ideally 20. And so we'll see how we do with it. We might need to do a part two, but let's see. So
we've ever done 20 minutes.
Yes. Well, I don't think that's right. As for two of us doing it together, so let's try this. And I'm in Bangkok, in case you want to know, and we've gotten feedback that video is important. A lot of guys are watching this through video, so we will endeavor to create video for you, despite the fact that we're in different parts of the world, and keeping the audio quality up. So here we go. So the polarity issue, and I think a good entree into this, or a good segue into this, is toxic masculinity. I've been asked a lot about this topic, to talk about the topic for years, and I've been doing research on, in order to talk about toxic masculinity, you have to think about feminism. So it took me quite a while to read up on feminism. Not all of it was enjoyable reading. Not much of it was. And that was another reason why I was delaying a response. But I think I feel a bit more confident about that now to speak on that. And so let's just dive into it. Toxic masculinity. I think the problem with this term is that it's used often to just talk about masculinity in general. So it's not as if it's toxic masculinity is assumed to be the default masculinity. Like masculinity is toxic, let's get rid of it. So often what happens is the argument in articles that use this term or books that use this term is to radically redefine masculinity in a way that in a way that it hasn't been used before. So toxic masculinity is used often to describe the entirety of of the history of masculinity in Homo sapien history, right? So like masculinity throughout history has been toxic because it's responsible for wars and violence and all this other stuff. And we need to get rid of it in order for happiness to ensue and for liberation to occur for both sexes. And so I don't think that is a good way of looking at it. I think there is a masculinity that's toxic, just as there is a femininity that's toxic. And there's non-toxic masculinity. I think we should try to maybe think of a sexier term for it and then just start trying to popularize it. But there's a masculinity in and of itself isn't toxic. It can become toxic. And so what a good way to get into it is to think about the term toxic. I think this is interesting because something is a toxin in the system if one way it could be a toxin is if it ferments, like it's there too long and it rots. And that's a good way of describing masculine energy in the modern world. In the 21st century, in many places in which you would be listening to this podcast, masculinity in its expressions in pre-modern times would be redundant, irrelevant, or over the top, right? So like one great thing that masculinity gives you in terms of reproduction and survival value is that's the edge in competition. So if you think about the effects of testosterone, which is really what masculinity comes down to scientifically, versus estrogen, which is what would define femininity. Increases in testosterone would give you a lot of advantages in a fight, in giving you that edge in a competition, in giving you drive and motivation to do things, as well as all of the obvious health benefits of bone strength and all the muscle tissue and all of that other stuff.
Of course, testosterone comes from overcoming challenge very specifically. That's why going to the gym produces testosterone.
Right. So the more competitions you win, the more masculine you become, and then it's a virtuous circle or cycle for that. And it becomes toxic when it's not needed, or when it's not expressed, or when it's not used. So imagine you have in your system. I'll try this analogy. I've never talked about it before. You are the Hulk, okay? And let's assume you're the Hulk, and you have this amazing superpower, but you never get to use it. And every time, you get angry a lot because you haven't been through therapy. So the Hulk is getting angry. He's having to suppress turning into the Hulk like all the time, and it just drains him. And he's, there's the depiction by Ang Lee of this is one of the classic Hulk movies, and I think it was Edward Norton who played the Hulk. It was Chris Bana. I forget, it's Eric Bana or something. Anyway, so that suppression was a major theme in that movie. Just trying to keep the Hulk down, try not to get angry, just keep the breathing going, keep it. And recently in the Thor Ragnarok, recently for me, Thor Ragnarok, the Hulk just walks around and he's talking. This is like a new depiction of the Hulk. But in the old depictions, it was a lot more psychological. It was a lot more Jekyll and Hyde. And that's sort of the situation of simple masculinity as simply testosterone and the characteristics that testosterone would create in modern culture, in contemporary culture, in a technologically advanced culture. There's still tons of competition. I think that's part of the complaint about masculinity, how Wall Street is driven by it, and that's part of the reason why there was that big, all of the problems that were, the big depression of whatever it was, 2008, and all that. And that's toxic because it's not expressed properly. So it's rotting and festering, and it's becoming poisonous. So I've talked a lot. I'm going to let Henry get in on that. But so what I'm saying here is masculinity doesn't have to be toxic.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe it would be good to take a step back and talk a bit about what we mean by masculinity and femininity to begin. I think the problem is a lot of people associate that with gender identity, for starters, right? So if you're, men masculinity, women femininity, I certainly don't think they necessarily need to be. Most men in their essence, if they're living in their true essence, I think are masculine. Likewise, most women are feminine, but not always. You can certainly have men who are principally feminine and vice versa. So I think that's the first and very important thing to think about. If you're a woman and your principal energy is masculine, you will never truly feel fulfilled if you're not living in that energy, and vice versa. And it is obviously a lot easier in society, I guess, for most people to, if you're a man to be masculine and a woman to be feminine, and it's significantly more challenging if it's the other way around. And I think if you try and, as you say, repress and stuff yourself into roles in which you are not, it's just not you, that doesn't work. And we can talk a bit about how this has perhaps played out in different societies a bit later on. But just to say that I think that's a very, very important distinction, understanding the difference between energy and gender. And I think a lot of people conflate the two. And I would actually say that I think gay people understand that the need for that energy more than most, right? So if you have two men, obviously you're the same gender, but I think that, and we'll talk about this later, about polarity, you need very clearly polarity. You need someone with a more masculine and a more feminine energy, or at least at a given point in time when they come together, one person must play each of those roles. And I think that is very clear. And I think that we forget about that in our society, in our relationships. And again, we can talk about, I guess, the issue of polarity a bit later. But I think the single biggest issue when it comes to this topic that faces people is that they believe that they should be a certain way when that is not the true essence. So, in Asia, for example, where we both live, I think it is very common. And I think this is true of societies everywhere. Tony Robbins talks about how both the masculine and the feminine, when you get stressed, you tend to flip into the other side, right? When men get stressed, they become more feminine in the energies and vice versa. And that's not great because you must live in your true essence. Otherwise, long term, you can never be happy. And if you are perpetually stressed, as a man, for example, and you perpetually express that feminine energy, you're not going to get very far. Anyway, actually, I think before I ramble on, I should perhaps talk a bit about what I think of anyway when I think of masculine and feminine energies. The classic Chinese talk about the yin and the yang, right? And I think that is perhaps one of the better concepts, the duality of it. I think that the problem is that for a lot of people, even the concept of the yin and the yang gets misconstrued as like good and bad, right? Mm-hmm. Light and dark. And it's very easy to think of one or the other of those energies as being better than the other. And they're not, right? Again, the Taoists will tell you they're just two halves of the same whole, right? Everything requires balance, right? There's no light without darkness. There is no, heat without cold, right? Life is about balance, about contrasts. There is no good or bad to the yin and the yang. They're just different. The yang, and you're the Chinese philosopher, so you know this better than I do, right? But the yang is right, the sort of, in many cases, the masculine energy. But again, I think it's important to separate that from a concept of even like being a man, right? The masculine energy is just that energy, as you say, is the drive, it is the impetus force, versus the feminine energy, which is the receiving force. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is obviously a big and complex topic, but understanding the nature of those energies, and that if I am, for example, a masculine man, what that means to express and to live in that energy, I think is very, very important. And a lot of times you end up talking about gender roles. We end up talking about gender roles in society, for example, right? Women's rights. And I don't think that is the same thing, right, as masculine and feminine energies. And I think that is the bit that gets lost in most discussions today.
Yeah. So I'm really glad you took it that direction. Also, I was also getting into this dangerous territory of teaching about masculinity, and so I have a whole course that called Masculine Mastery that itself runs 5 weeks, and I think it gets into like 15 hours of content. I think I can do a separate podcast just on masculinity and some of the immature forms of masculinity. But one really important thing to think of, to realize whenever there are very heated emotional arguments and debates is the use of terms. So people trigger each other using terms that are misconstrued often. And one of them is gender and sex and energies. So you're going with the energies. And one of the things about gender is in the humanities is the argument that gender is completely socially constructed. And then people on the right say that's completely ridiculous, but they're not realizing that the left is using gender differently. So gender is often used in the sense of like how you think about yourself in terms of like an identity. Whereas sex, what's your sex? That's a medical definition. So if you have a penis, you are a male. So that's why I like to reserve the terms male and female for when you're trying to highlight the biological differences. And men and women, those are such common terms, but men and women or masculine, feminine as gender identities. And those are more fluid because you could be a female, biological female, and yet have a masculine identity. So there are some lesbians who are like the butch lesbians, so to speak, right? Like shave their heads, tape their boobs, and they're really thinking like men. Mm-hmm. And I bet, so I haven't done enough research on this, but I bet if you got the blood test, you'd just find that their testosterone is higher than average female, and so on, right? And that's where those terms break apart. So there are two sexes, and there may be an infinite number of genders, depending on how you want to go into the humanities, define that sort of thing. If it's truly socially constructed, you could just make up your own gender. It'd be weird if no one accepts that term, but you can live in your own weird reality, I suppose. But and this is where it gets iffy, right? So this is where you were talking about how overall males have masculine energy as their home, and so this is something that I think is a really great principle or an assumption, a guiding assumption for life. If you're a coach like me or a therapist or something, then it gets a little dangerous because it becomes prescriptive. But what we could say is this: if you are a male, very likely, like, you should really think about the fact that probably your home energy is masculine, and if you're female, your home energy is feminine.
Yeah.
And
I think by home energy, just to clarify to everyone out there, we mean that that's the energy that you would feel most fulfilled in, not necessarily the energy in which you actually live in.
Right, not operationally.
As you say, right? I think biological sex is one level. Gender is another level, right? In many ways, a socially constructed identity, gender expectations, and then you have energy, which is very fluid from moment to moment. People can flip in and out of energies, right? So that's why, when I talked about gay men, for example, I don't mean to presuppose that they necessarily have fixed identities. It's just that in a relationship, right? Again, when you can talk a little later about polarity, if you don't have those two separate roles, or at least someone playing in those two separate energies at any given time, like a lot of relationships out there, it ends up being just very flat.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, I think the Taoists understood this very well. The yin yang symbol, which I'm sure everyone has seen, has the yin and the yang sort of curving into each other. They're not two separate things. They are two aspects of one single circle. And of course, people always forget there's a dot, right, in the other one. So you have the yang with the dot of the yin, right? There's a kernel of yin in the yang, and it flows. It's a cycle. And like I said, I think a lot of people, likewise, they think about energy, and they still think in terms of these sort of very rigid definitions of, and as you say, there are all kinds of preconceptions, and people talk about these things very differently. But talking specifically about the energies, I think, well, actually, you probably should give us all perhaps a better definition of the yin and yang. I'm sure you do much better than I do.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So the passion in a relationship comes from the degree of polarity, right? So I have a whole free course on this called "How to Make a Relationship Passionate." It's a very descriptive title. And if you want to get into that course, I have it includes about an hour long explanation for why that's the case, why passion comes from polarity, and what you can do about it if you find yourself in a relationship that lacks passion. And you can get that on my website. If you just go to the website, it should be on the homepage to sign up for that, davidtianphd.com, and you'll see it. So, but in a nutshell, and again, in the course, I go into a lot more detail about the how-tos and the step-by-steps, is the power of polarity is what creates the passion. It's sort of like electrical currents, right? The plus and the minus. If it's plus, nothing is going to happen. They're actually going to repel. If it's minus, same thing. So you need to have the plus and the minus to get the electricity going. And in Chinese, there's the term fa dian, which is like when you look at each other and there's electricity in the air. And that comes from polarity, right? That's the idea of a complementary polarity, like a seesaw is another metaphor that I use to describe this. If one's up and the other's down, then you're having fun, right? There's movement. If you're equal, then it's a really boring seesaw and nothing's going on, right? And you'll have to try to create that passion out of nowhere, and it doesn't last. It's not natural because you're basically the same. So a couple that is just the same, like they're both the same, and in all of their sexual energies are going to, is what I call a situation of depolarization. And it could have been unpolarized. I don't know, maybe in an arranged marriage that wasn't well thought out. But often it's depolarized because just to be in a relationship, an intimate relationship, there must have been passion at the beginning. But over time, what happens is you become more and more alike, and you want to fight less and less generally, but that's often not realized. But you become best friends. You just become good friends. And the sexual chemistry is gone, the passion's gone, because the depolarization has occurred. And that's the basis of it, and that's why it's so important to think about that. And there's an episode of Black Mirror. I can't remember which season. Can't remember right now. But it's an early season, I think. And it's one that, in the episode, they think about the future. In the future, the sexes would be equal opportunists in the mating game. So the computer spits out a pairing, and you have to play this pairing, or the police are going to come and catch you. So you have to go to the bar or whatever and meet your date that the computer set up for you. And when you both swipe on your phones, it tells you the expiry date. And they show that the females are just hooking up the same as the males. Because in the future, everyone's equal in this sense, and they all want to have sex and have casual sex until the computer tells them you are now in a relationship, and then you can be allowed to open up and feel things. And what it showed in the Black Mirror episode was that the woman who was the main character, who was basically just putting out with every single dude, because that's what they do in the future, was feeling really unfulfilled. Whereas the dudes were like, okay, cool, free sex with a random stranger. And then, so, okay, see ya in the morning. It's just like, see ya with no emotions, right? But then like the computer kept hooking her up with a 48-hour fling, a 72-hour fling, another 48-hour fling. So she was basically like a prostitute who wasn't getting paid, and she was really unfulfilled. And in the episode, in the middle of it, she's just like, "This sucks. I hate it, but I have to do this. It was really horrible." And that's sort of like what is happening now, right? When an entire society forcibly depolarizes the genders, the couples will be unfulfilled.
Yeah. Well, maybe if you could talk a bit about how you would define masculine.
Yes, so let's define it. I don't know what minute in the podcast we're finally in, but let's define our terms. So so one of the great exponents of masculine and feminine energies is Tony Robbins, of all people. And I think he reserves this lesson or getting deeper into masculine and feminine for his more pricey higher end programs, partly I think because it is more politically sensitive, or it's less politically correct in the current time. So with that having been said, I am taking some inspiration from his one of his seminars on the State with Destiny, where I learned some of where I was first exposed to a very clear presentation of masculine and feminine in terms of relationship. And so here's some. So it's hard to define it. So I'm going to define it scientifically as far as I can, and then I'm going to define it more from like a humanistic literary approach, which is what Tony Robbins takes. But the scientific approach is what dominates masculinity studies in the academy and the universities, and this is why there's so much worry about toxic masculinity, and what it doesn't pay attention to is the psychological. So the purely physical masculinity is any personality traits that are encouraged or developed by more testosterone in the system. So you can see how that could quickly become toxic. You get too aggressive, too assertive, and maybe like too violent, seeking out competition and challenge and so on. And then but like at the most basic level, you can define masculinity as whatever testosterone would encourage. And you can define femininity as whatever estrogen encourages. And this can lead into immature femininity and immature masculinity. And it could be the opposite, well-developed masculinity or mature masculine and immature feminine. So I want to think more about the testosterone estrogen effects, but from a literary angle or a literary approach, here are some ways of talking about the feminine. I'm going to give a bunch of those. I'm going to list them out. And then I'm going to list out a bunch of ways of talking about the masculine. So these are more evocative ways of thinking about what feminine and masculine are. So the feminine is open, flowing, nurturing, wild, and free. Okay, so when you see a woman in her feminine energy, in her living in her feminine core, she's going to be more in tune with nature, with her surroundings, with the music, letting her hair down, so to speak, or maybe literally, and moving to the music, and free and wild. And this is partly what historically has been meant by feminine energy or yin energy. Mm-hmm. And of course, this could, in uptight traditional times throughout the world, this has also been vilified as the basis of vice. So in ancient Chinese history, yin could be the yin energy could be the source of naughty devilry, partly because of that wild and free nature that it embodies. Okay, also, I'm just going to go more quickly through some of these. I have about 10 bullet points here. It's directed down toward the earth. The feminine is moved primarily by the emotions. The feminine looks for life and connection. The feminine draws others in through opening of the heart to beauty and love and appreciates the aesthetic. The feminine wants to fill up with energy and attention. The feminine desires to be noticed and praised. Feminine energy lives in a world of sensation, physical connection to nature. The feminine is addicted to ways of filling her emptiness. This could be obviously good or bad. The feminine wants to feel understood. The feminine hangs on to everything and sometimes hangs on too long. This is there's a great illustration that Tony Robbins uses about purses versus wallets. So this is the idea of like the women, they naturally fill up these huge purses full of all the stuff that they. And when you look through the purse, there's all these old receipts and old membership cards they haven't used in years and things like that. Whereas men like to throw shit out, and when they're in the masculine men like to have the most thin wallet system possible. And there's always some guy in the room who doesn't even carry a wallet. He just carries his card, with like naked card and some cash. The feminine hears primarily emotion in mood and tone. Okay, so those are some evocative ways of describing the feminine. And then let's get into the masculine. So I have even more bullet points to get into the masculine. The masculine is centeredness, rigidity, unwavering purpose and strength. I love that. Rigidity is such an evocative term. The masculine is directed up towards the sky. Remember, the feminine is directed down toward the earth. And by the way, these are also taken like very Jungian ways, as in the ways of like archetypes. So psychology has its history in mythology and philosophy. So directed up versus directed down. The masculine is primarily driven by direction or mission. The masculine grows in the face of death. The masculine focuses on one task at a time. The masculine looks for problems and wants to fix them. The masculine seeks release from the constraints and burdens of life. The masculine strives to break free to freedom and ecstasy. And I love the David Ware, the Superior Man, and his returns to the theme of why men love sports. They're always about breaking barriers, putting a ball through a hoop, or taking a ball and breaking through the finish line, and so on. These are all masculine energy pursuits. The masculine wants to be empty and let go. The masculine strives to break free to freedom. The masculine responds to challenge and comes alive at the edge. The masculine loves competition to test and break through. The masculine is addicted to emptying and releasing himself into the void. The masculine wants to feel appreciated. The masculine finds it easy to let go and leave, and often leaves too soon. And the masculine speaks words over emotions. So these are historically ways of defining and delineating the two. And just before I forget, I want to point out that out of this comes ways of meeting feminine intimacy needs and masculine intimacy needs. So feminine intimacy needs, what a feminine woman or feminine energy would make them flourish is feeling that you're giving her attention. So what shuts down feminine intimacy is feeling unseen. And the fix for that is giving her attention, or giving the feminine the attention. The feminine, and the second one, I'll give you three. The second is the feminine, what shuts down feminine intimacy is feeling that she is not understood. So men and women should see these themes in their own lives. I'm feeling unseen, feeling misunderstood or not understood. And the way to make somebody feel understood is by giving them your presence. So I have a whole other free course on presence, the how-tos, and a detailed explanation of that. So again, go to the webpage and sign up for that. And finally, what shuts down feminine intimacy is feeling unsafe, that she can't trust you. And the fix for that is giving her reassurance. And what's interesting is that what the feminine is yearning for, craving, starving for, is attention, presence, and reassurance. And at the very least, attention and reassurance is exactly the thing that macho men can't be open to giving, because it would make them feel unmasculine. And in fact, that's a toxic masculinity, right? That's an immature masculinity. And maybe it's not toxic, but it's definitely immature. And that's one of the reasons why there's a breakdown of communication between the sexes in the modern West. And then just to finish it off, the masculine. What does the masculine need? What shuts down masculine intimacy is being criticized. And the fix for that is, for women or the feminine, is if she admires and appreciates you. So as a man, if you think about it, it's pretty easy to stroke your ego and get you into a good state, a suggestive state, if you start off with admiration and appreciation. The second thing that shuts down masculine intimacy is feeling closed. right? So if you feel closed down, and the fix for that is if she is open and playful. And the weakness, you can see this is in big macho dads who are just destroyed by their little daughters. When the little daughters come in, they're playing with their little ponies or whatever, and they're open and playful, and it just melts the big macho dude's heart, if he has one. And then the third is what shuts down masculine intimacy is feeling controlled. And there's this great activity, I don't know what to call it, in Date with Destiny. I think on day 5 or something. I don't know when he does it, but that freedom thing where he makes it and he uses the Braveheart scene, and it's just like this clarion call for masculinity, which is the yearning for freedom, to break free, to break through, and to get autonomy. And the opposite of that is feeling controlled, even if it's for your own good. As a masculine man, you just don't want to be told what to do. Right? Or as a masculine person, even masculine woman, that's masculine energy there that you're responding with when you don't want to feel controlled. And the fix for this is if she gives you freedom and love. Right? So being criticized, being closed, being controlled, women can open men up by admiring and appreciating them, by being open and playful, and by giving them freedom and love. And she can only do that if she is comfortable in her feminine energy.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think the mistake a lot of people make is when they hear about masculine and feminine, they immediately think about gender roles primarily. And even worse, a lot of people will think, oh, well, masculine equals strong, feminine equals weak. And, I think entirely fairly, because historically, right, the social contracts in a patriarchal society have looked that way. And people don't even think, again, all the things that you talked about the energies. And so I think we end up within the society where a lot of men are told, well, the stereotypical toxic masculinity, as you said, you need to tamp that down, whereas women are told that you need to learn to speak out and do more. And they think that therefore that means I need to become more masculine. And of course, that couldn't be further from the truth, right? These things have nothing to do with strength or weakness. Right? There's nothing you can be a very strong feminine. And in fact, I think that in order to be a very strong feminine, if that is your energy, you need to be able to live within the energy, right? Flipping to the masculine is never going to get you there. I see a lot of women who are told that, well, if you want to be successful, right, or if you want to be a modern woman, right, you're smart, you're a strong woman, therefore you need to follow a certain life path, which usually involves being very career oriented. Nothing wrong with that, but they, I guess, explicitly or implicitly are told that you need to lead a life that looks very much like a masculine life, when in fact you can do all of those same things and be a very strong, powerful woman by living deeply and richly in the feminine. All the things that you've just talked about, all of those energies. And I think you will be stronger, more fulfilled, and more successful if you did that. If you ask any group of men how they respond to a very masculine, woman, one who is clearly not living in that energy, right? It just somehow, as you say, that it just doesn't, it's almost like a repelling force. But when you have a very feminine woman, even in a business context, you put a very feminine woman in a boardroom and it's magnetic, right? All guys know this. The draw of a woman who is truly living in the feminine and who has that freedom you were talking about earlier is very hard to resist. And you can have a whole group of very stereotypically, strong in the masculine sense men eating out of the palm of your hand. They will do anything for you.
Oh yeah.
Right? And I think that you talk about these energies, and the problem is that most people, again, under conditions of stress or societal expectation or otherwise, don't actually live in those energies. And I think the adjectives that you talked about are absolutely fantastic. The way I think about it is that, as you mentioned, like David Tian talks about, the masculine is about breaking through barriers, right? And the search for freedom, the release into emptiness, I think is a classical sort of a bit of a yang, right? The idea that if I can just overcome my barrier, I will be released into that void. For the feminine energy is the complete opposite. It is about filling up. It is about opening up and allowing, yourself to be filled up. And obviously, I don't actually know why it is the way it is. You can draw on biological conclusions to, try to argue why it is that the sort of traditional masculine energy wants to be the penetrating force, if you will, and the feminine was the
I
receiving.
think it's pretty obvious, Henry.
But I mean, that is how it works. Not in a purely physical or sexual context, but in a energy context, right? The pervasive masculine and the loving receiving feminine. And again, I think it's really worth re-emphasizing this point that there is nothing good or bad or strong or weak or any of these energies, right? They're just different. We all need both at different times.
Yes.
And if you can only live in one energy, that is broken as well. But for most of us, we have one that is dominant, one that we need to spend most of our time living in. And again, it's a gross generalization, obviously, but I would venture that most men are a masculine energy by nature, and most men don't actually live there. And likewise, most women have a feminine energy by nature, and most women don't live there either. And all of us get caught up in fulfilling gender roles, and we think that, okay, well, if a man means playing sports or a woman means going to the spa, I am fulfilling my energy. And we get caught up in that layer without actually thinking through to the deeper layer of the energy, right? If as a man, what you are doing is not, you truly facing up to the barriers in your life and overcoming them, facing up to those challenges, you aren't really living in your masculine. And likewise, as a woman, you can be a very successful woman, but if you don't approach life with that sense of opening up to the world and to love, I don't think you can be truly fulfilled either. And perhaps to add on to your sort of the medical definition and the sort of the emotive literary definition, I came across this passage a while ago, which really struck me. This is talking a bit about sort of from the sort of the masculine perspective, but I thought it was a beautiful description of the interplay between masculine and feminine. And it says, if you force her, she will never open up. If you are impatient, she will sense your weakness. If you are nervous, she will be nervous too. You cannot convince with words. You do not signify meaning with loudness, confidence with physical strength, trust with muscles. The secret is no secret. Your strength is about yourself, not her. It is the calm, precise steadiness within, your inner balance, control, your decisive approach to life and its challenges, to details, and the capability to always know how to succeed with efficiency and not with brute force alone. And this inner strength will unfold in her senses, bloom in her soul, anchor her heart, and will nurture and meet her needs and allow her to love you like you've never been loved before. Unconditionally strong in defenseless trust. And I found that very, very powerful. And
what's the source of that?
I honestly can't remember. I found it somewhere on the internet.
Okay, you got to get that to me. I'll make it into a quote card for Instagram or something.
I'll look it up. But it's again, I think it just shows how powerful it can be when we truly live in our essence and we understand that we need polarity in our lives. We need the other. There is no right or wrong. There is no single path, right? It's just as wrong for everyone to try and be feminine, everyone to try and be masculine. Right? We need each other. And we're like two halves that fit perfectly into each other. Right. Funny how that works out.
I think so I think part of the debate that's going on in the academy about confusion in the academy and resistance to thinking about masculine, feminine, in just in ways of like being more masculine or being more feminine, is that a lot of times men are in their masculine, but in an immature expression of it. So now this would then take us down a whole other road of another hour podcast, but and I'll do another podcast on it to go more detail. But some examples that you about, Henry, are like the mama's boy. Like that's a masculine, but that's a very immature masculine. Or the addicted woman, the addicted lover. So there are some women who are just giving themselves over, while that's feminine. And there are feminine players, there are masculine players, but those are all immature expressions of masculine and feminine energy. Then there's the grandstander bully, versus the coward. These are both found within they're both found within a masculine energy, but it's immature masculine. There's the tyrant, the sadist, and these are when you take the masculine too far in ways, or that it's not regulated or controlled or within your grasp, and it's just free to go and just take you over. When the masculine energy controls you instead of you being able to use it when you want. And that's part of the confusion, because there are ways in which men and women, masculine and feminine, can relate to each other that are harmful and dangerous to each other. So like one of the pushbacks for the red pill, and there's like this anti-woman movement, like the men go their own way or something. Anyway, and that's partly because it is a response to the immature female, the immature feminine, I should say. That doesn't know when is the right time to love versus to dance wildly and to hook up. What's the proper use? What's the mature use of sexuality in feminine and masculine expressions? And that's the problem. So let me go back to the tripartite distinction that you started off with: sex, gender, and energy. So sex, that's pretty obvious. I think that there shouldn't be any debate on that. But then there is debate, because people they blur the categories of sex and gender. So gender is male, female, men and women, and you could be your gender identity could be a man, and yet your energy could be feminine. Right, so then we get to energy, and what you're saying about the yin yang of sometimes to be a mature person, no matter what your home energy is, you shouldn't be there all the time. So I think maybe 80-20 would be a good default. I don't know, just because I like 80-20, a default way of, like, if you're a masculine person, that 80% of the time in most contexts you're going to be masculine, and then 20% of the time you can be feminine, and that's a mature person. And then or an 80% feminine and a 20% masculine. But there's a home energy that you're in. And part of the toxic masculinity worry is that there are men who want to be 100% masculine, all the time, and they're immature masculine. They become bullies and tyrants and rapists, or they retreat into like a mama's boy, dreamer, coward, worrier, and these are all immature masculine. So the immaturity of, like, are you psychologically developed, is an important part. And I think one of the problems is because of people's lack of history, right, of reading the classics, that they can't plug into the role models of history, and they're looking around looking for, like, what's masculine look like, and they see a bully, and then and then they look, what's a feminine role model for mature feminine? They see, like, the club girl, or I don't know, I don't know. I was going to say Kardashians, but I don't know them that well. But some, like, pop media figure who's just flaunting her sexuality and in ways that turn off some of the people who are asking this question, right? And that's the confusion. And I think, like, once you get from sex to gender, from gender to energy, you realize that the energy is a choice. You can stay 80% of the time. You can have a default energy as a man in the masculine, but when you're playing with your 2-year-old daughter, you're going to move into your feminine energy, right? And then when she falls and she needs daddy to pick her up, you'll be back in your masculine. And a really great analogy that I came up with for my coaching is, if you can think about, as you're developing your masculine, let's say you find yourself, as is the case with a lot of Singaporean males, too much in their mama's boy or coward energy, and they want to grow into a mature masculine. But then they need to know, like, when do I explore the aesthetic? When do I explore being connected to nature in my environment and being wild and free? When do I know how to do that? And I tell them, like, imagine this, a war, like a commander, military commander, general on the front lines, comes back home, and he's got a little daughter, and she comes running to him, and he's telling his sergeant or whatever, and he's ending a meeting, and he turns around, and he's very much in his commander mode. And then she's like, "Daddy, Daddy," she tugs at his shirt, and she's asking him, can she play with her doll or something? And he's immediately, boom, is into a nurturing energy, picks her up, gives her a kiss, swings her around, and he's back into that energy to match her and to nurture her, right? And that's sort of like that energy that a mature person can play with. Mm-hmm. When to be masculine, when to be feminine, when the default and his when he's most relaxed, or when she, as a feminine woman, is more relaxed. And I think part of the confusion and the lack of fulfillment in life is, as you were pointing out, Henry, is the fact that many men are being told to be in the feminine energy more. And they're basically, the world is trying to tell them to be 50-50, and not just 50-50 masculine, feminine, but 50-50 immature masculine and immature feminine. And none of that is fulfilling at all to them.
Exactly. No, and I think you're talking earlier about a term. I think we need to move from the immature masculine and feminine to the enlightened masculine and feminine, and to realize that, again, you talk about women flaunting this, sexuality. I think, again, there are very different ways to do it, right? There's a difference between sexuality and, that feminine energy and power. And again, I think if a lot of women talk to a lot of men, they would very quickly be able to figure out the difference. Raw sexuality doesn't always turn on most men, versus when you have a woman who really truly is living in a yin, right, in that feminine energy. Like I said, it is, you can tell because like men can sense that, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like this pull, right? Someone walks into a room and and vice versa, right? I think if you talk to a lot of women about what the real enlightened masculine feels like, it's not about the bully, the guy strutting around, right? But someone who's truly in his masculine core. When he walks into a room, every woman notices.
Yeah.
What's sex energy, right? You feel it.
I think if you've been around enough, you have seen a person of the opposite gender or sex who is on paper, like in a photograph, perfect, like they look great. But then as soon as they start to behave, they just like, not really interested, and that sexuality, and vice versa. You've seen somebody who, if you just saw a photo of that person, you'd think they were just average or whatever. Mm-hmm. But then in the way that they express themselves and the move and talk and look at you, and then they suddenly become much more attractive. And
David Tian talks about how, I guess when you get right down to it, the masculine is the search for freedom, right? Freedom from constraint, freedom from fear, and the woman is about the search for love, right? And that's why I think the masculine finds the feminine so compelling. Someone who truly is, a woman who's free to and lives with that presence, and just, I guess, that freedom we find so absolutely compelling, because that is basically what all men have been searching for all their lives, right?
Right. So at bottom, everyone actually wants love. Exactly. They want the freedom so that they can love.
Exactly.
But women want to feel connected and filled up. So, and one last thing, we need to wrap up here. One last thing. This I had this idea of so you were explaining how there's merit to the feminine, and there's merit, so telling a man or telling a woman to woman up and a man to man up, and that being that yin energy or the feminine energy isn't bad. So how many females think that they need to be in order to become dominant and win in the competition of the world is to be like a male, to be like a man, and how that's false. That there is a feminine power that can disarm any man, and you're sort of seeing that because the aggressive females now are banking on historically how men are responding to women as historically, that they're looking at women as if it's still the 1950s, and that's going to change soon. But you can't talk back. You can't just argue down a woman quickly like that. It just looks like you're a bully. Because if a woman, I remember, so I'm going to share this one anecdote. I was in debating back in high school and university, and there was this one girl, this little, I think she was 4'10", blonde girl with a feminine voice, and it was all males. It was 80-90% dudes in debating, and when it's two dudes against two dudes, it's just all out. They're talking over each other, and then the referee's having to intervene and but she's in there in the final. I remember watching this, and this guy was just bullying her. Like he wouldn't let, in the Q&A, he wouldn't let her answer properly. And so she would just, all she did to just shut him down completely was raise her hand and say, "May I speak now? May I speak now? May I speak?" And then the referee was just like, "Stop this." And he just got really mad. Like the teacher got really mad at that student who was just like bullying her. And then she said, "Thank you." And then she's slowly, but surely just tore him apart, and in the sweetest voice. And it was just like this evisceration. And everyone's just, she was quoting Tolstoy and all this. And it was so different from all of the other very aggressive energies that were out there, which when you're aggressive, it makes sense to be aggressive. And then there's like, sort of like, what do you call that? It just escalates. So no one wins and the whole thing just blows up. But when you add a new type of energy in there, it's a new type of power. So I thought of this other thing as you were speaking, superheroes. Right? So like there are certain superheroes that are all brute force, like the Hulk, and they're powerful if he was just like a one-on-one fight. But then there are superheroes who use feminine energy. And a great illustration of this that's very relevant or current is how the Scarlett Johansson figure, sort of Black Widow, is it?
Yeah.
Her superhero character. They use her to turn the Hulk back into Bruce Banner. Is it Bruce Banner? Banner, anyway. So she's like, it's, the sun's low, and she calms him down, and then he's like, and he turns into, from the green guy back into the human being again. And that's a great illustration for, just an analogy and a metaphor, I should say, for how the feminine can dominate the masculine, how the masculine wants that actually as well. But when you're a feminine energy and you try to be the Hulk, it's just a disaster. I mean, you're not going to be happy. You're going to lose because you're not naturally the Hulk. And, and then, so all of this is happening because people don't appreciate superheroes enough.
Yeah.
Every superhero has its own power. And you got to figure out what the role is and the place and position for that power. Even the little guys like Ant-Man.
Yeah. That's the point, right? That's what I mean. There's not the yin or the yang, or which one should you pick, or which one is better. Again, you come back, you look at the circle, right? They fit perfectly into each other, and I think that's the way nature designed us. I think it's beautiful, right? Like to the masculine, there is nothing more. There's nothing more powerful than the feminine, right? There is. Right, men can, like the masculine can fight, but as you say, when a true feminine comes along, she will sweep the masculine away, and vice versa. I think to the feminine, there's nothing more intoxicating than the masculine, and that's how we were designed. It's perfect, right? We fit perfectly into each other. We need each other's energies perfectly,
right? Just like our biology.
Exactly, our biology. I mean, isn't it amazing, right? We literally fit.
Well, yeah, it all starts from the biology. Really, I mean, we explain it all through the biology. And then the biological effects in the brain and the brain's effects, and the way we think about psychology. And then the social constructionism is just messing up all of our naturally, they're not natural conduits for finding fulfillment and happiness and love. So, well, on that note, we went way over. I think we were partly successful in getting under the time, but we will have to take up this topic again. Go on forever on this. And thanks so much for listening. Henry, how do they get a hold of you?
You can find me on my website at henrychong.com. You can look me up. I write a newsletter every week, and you can sign up for that on my website too.
Yes. And you can connect with me in many places, but you can start with davidtianphd.com. Also, you can find the show notes for this episode at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD Podcast. All right. So you can see those in there. Also, we have a private Facebook group, a secret Facebook group. So actually, it's not secret. It's a closed Facebook group. So you can click the link and log into Facebook and join the group. All right. I'll see you in there. Thanks so much for listening, and we will be talking to you next time. Hey, it's David again. Before you go, a couple last things. First, all the show notes and links to resources can be found at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD Podcast. Or you can just go to davidtianphd.com and find it through the top navigation menu. Second, if you'd like to interact with me or other like-minded fans of the podcast, then join our private DTPHD Podcast Facebook group. We've got an awesome community of intelligent, wise individuals from literally all around the world. You can send a join request to the group using the link you'll find in the show notes of every podcast at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD Podcast. Click the link, log into your Facebook, and then click to join. We approve join requests every day. So go to davidtianphd.com and click the link to join. See you inside our group.
you.